Webinar. With that, let me introduce our speaker today. Our speaker today is Jameson Boone. He's an extension specialist in forestry here at North Carolina State University. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jameson. Jameson?
Sure. Thanks for having me today, Bob. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. See if this works out. Okay, so there's my contact information if you want to ask me questions after, or another time about anything that we talk about today. You hear anything you want to learn more information about, please reach out. I mean, we can always organize more webinars. This is part 2 presentation, so if you weren't for part 1, totally fine. This is just focus on management and some species. So I'd like to introduce these topics. We're talking about land use history in North Carolina. Super important for where we got today, why we have what we have, and how we can improve it. So historically, we've had a lot of low regular fire use by Native Americans. Usually this was to do agriculture, hunting, edible plants. A lot of the plants we have, that some of them are disappearing. We still have a lot of it. But think blueberry, blackberry, raspberry, a lot of those plants, understory plants, are very pyrophytic. So vocabulary word today, means this relies on fire. They liked open forest for hunting. It's a mix of grasslands. It's I think prairie land where buffalo roamed. There's a lot of use of animals. So even post-European settlement, pigs were big, cows were big. After European settlement, there were still some of these fire-tolerant pine and hardwood forests, and it made our forests very adaptable. They need disturbance, they need fire, they need regular management, and we'll talk about some of those management options. So in the 1600s to 1880, well, I picked 1880, mainly the introduction of the steam engine. So we've had a lot of conversion to agriculture. People talk about Cold Mountain Book going to the Southern Appalachian and it just being clear and devoid. A lot of disturbance, especially getting up to the Civil War, 1860s. Wood was primarily used for heat. There's a lot of split rail fences too that use a lot of wood. Prescribed fire, not exactly how the Native Americans used it. It was mostly used to clear land, so it's a lot more destructive at that time. Harvesting was more viewed as mining. So there was some perception from at least American colonists that stayed here that we had an endless wood supply. And it's kind of interesting because Englishmen, British, noticed that in the 13th century, they destroyed all their forests and were constantly seeking for new wood supplies. So it's kind of interesting why they saw that as endless wood supply here. But it's just, our records kind of show that they even evaluate it for tax at it's similar to mining practices. They were not looking for what to regenerate. So steam engine, steam engine was developed earlier. I think rail increased wood utilization. So the picture I'm showing is of the Canton sawmill that closed down. Is either late last year or earlier this year. That's shortly after it actually got built. So it got built around 1883. Huge for the industry. A lot of unsustainable land practices, logging practices. All those things sped up. Very few virgin forests. A lot of people like to see an old forest and kind of envision that is perfect, maintained. Most of our forests now are 3rd or 4th generation forests. There was the chestnut blight during this time that killed all of our chestnut trees, at least mature trees. We still have some younger trees. Very few Native American chestnut trees left, though certain parts of the country, there's some residual ones that survived the blight, not many in North Carolina. So getting into the 1940s, I think post-World War II, you have Big Smokey the Bear program, and that was super important at the time. So think about when it was developed, it was we had these huge catastrophic fires. in the earlier time, I think 1913, there's a huge catastrophic fire. All the brush buildup from development, from the forest mining, just very bad fires all across the US. The peak of a lot of our wildfire numbers came from about this time or a little bit before Smoky Bear program. You have federal assistance programs. So think in the first blip you see in the bottom chart, around 1958, the Civilian Conservation Corps planted a ton of loblolly pine. It was kind of like an early introduction for the species. And then getting into 1985, we have the CRP program. If you don't know what that is, it's a program, we still have it today. They pay 30-year, 15 or 30-year leases on land. So that is highly erodible. So pine did great for erosion control. All these abandoned farm fields needed something on them, so they planted them in pine. That was the height of our planting numbers. It kind of declined from there, and it's been steady ever since. We also have tax deferment programs, so tax incentive programs to keep land forested. There's really interest in building our forest during this time. So today, we have tree improvement programs to make pine better, faster growing. Forest cover has generally stabilized. We're starting to get in certain areas, especially towards the mountain, and just hardwood forests are becoming over mature. So we're not seeing this regular small disturbances anymore. We kind of saw some of it in the hurricane. A lot of it is when we have a big disaster, some of it is made worse by having a lot of this old hardwood. And what we notice is that when we cut it, it's very hard to regenerate because younger trees are healthier, putting on more seed. Older trees don't necessarily do that. They don't resprout. We're getting a lot of over mature stands. There's been the emerald ash borer introduction, so it's spreading to almost all of North Carolina, I would say, here in the next few years. That kills pretty much all the ash trees that we don't treat every year. Forest fragmentation. So forest fragmentation is not necessarily what some people think it is. It's not harvesting, and then you have two different timber types. Forest fragmentation is removing something permanently outside of the use. So think housing development is a huge fragmentation, where you have blotches of housing developments around a forest. Makes it much more difficult to actually do harvesting when you remove a lot of the practical abilities to get stuff cut in a certain area. We have change in landowner types, so a lot less people tied to their land. They're seeing land as, for the nature value, for the conservation value. There's a lot of extension research related around these landowner types. We're seeing slowly that change as new landowners come in and different interests, and then new products and market changes. So you can go back to the first presentation, and we talk about, some of these products a little bit more. So current practices, foresters are talking about managing for future stands. So when we harvest, it's no longer just one harvest. You're talking about maybe multiple harvests on the same stand sometimes. Maybe it's tree planting, maybe it's natural regen. And then the timber industry is very reliant on landowners to get a lot of work done. So a lot of paper mills have divested their land, bought up by individual landowners, and now they're mainly, except for a few exceptions, buying on other people's property to feed their mill. They have foresters, industry foresters that go out and buy this land. You can see 65% of our land is non-industrial. So it's a huge percentage. So some things to remember from last time. So hardwoods are very site specific. The slope and landscape position matter. So whether it's a dry ridge, whether it's a wet cove, those things really matter for the productivity of the land. Generally, northern slopes are a little bit more productive, and as you get into cove forests, more productive. Planning needs to get done, and then consult a forester. So how to start? So you should have a management plan, and you should engage with those management plans. So the management plan at the minimum should have your species, your size, the quantity, and the productivity of the trees. So it should have the soil types in there that say, hey, this is what you have. This is the potential for some options, directions you could go. Landowners should always evaluate that plan. A lot of times you see expert says, okay, this is the only way to go. Well, it may just been that person's history, what they're used to, maybe they just are from another area and that's what they practice in that area. You want to evaluate the plan. You want to ask why and how that project will get done, the time frame, also what potential options are out there, maybe even beyond just one recommendation. Oftentimes, or sometimes there are multiple options. And then once you decide you want an inventory done, that can really decide, hey, looks like there's a lot of volume out here. Can we cut part of it? Do we have to cut the whole thing? Just some questions to think about. So some more questions: budget, timeline, chances they'll succeed, cost share options. So there's a lot of incentives right now to do multiple, different entries, different money that, may have you had a market for, you don't anymore. So think improvement cuts, hack and squirt, herbicide work, invasive species management, planting. Check with your state and federal resources for those options. There's a ton of resources out there that can help. What is the timeline for future management? So you want to set a budget for when you do a type of cut. You're going to have to probably go in and do some type of management in the future, especially if you want more of a natural stand hardwoods. And then, like I said, talk to your extension office or North Carolina Forest Service options with questions. They love to help. They can connect to me, connect to other resources throughout the state, cost share, NRCS. Those are kind of your first contact for other resources. So some considerations when you're choosing a species. So will that tree, what's kind of the mechanism for that tree resprouting? So will it resprout or will it grow back from seed? Some trees are much better at growing back from seed than others. Is it best at full sun or can it handle some shade? Do you need to do a full harvest or can you do a partial harvest and expect some of it to come back? So some other considerations, long-term planting, thinning, if you do pine, do you want to retain some trees for your wildlife habitat, or is letting it grow an option with minimal inputs? So kind of how we talk about trees for choosing are shade intolerant. So meaning they're full sun. If you're from the gardening world, you like, you pick your plants for what needs full sun versus, some shade. And then there's also shade tolerant trees that can grow in the full shade. Notice how many trees we have that are shade intolerant. We don't have many that are productive in North Carolina that are shade tolerant. Sugar maple is definitely secondary, grows on certain sites. We're not really going to talk about sugar maple management because that's more the Northeast of the US. So most of our trees, think pine, can grow really fast. What these trees do is they grow height first. They usually have smaller root systems. And what they do is they take advantage of that light before their other trees can. So oak, kind of opposite. So think it's partial shade intolerant or shade tolerant, meaning that just early on it has very more efficient photosynthetic rate. It stays little for a long time, taking advantage of any sunlight it can get, putting energy back into its roots. So when it does get opened up, it can take advantage and then grow up. The problem is if you have too much sun, well, that tree's sitting there, whether there's full sun or not, and other trees can grow up. So you have to do some type of management, shade management for some of these oak trees, which are essential for our forests. Where you had all these things happen while we have some of these oaks in really productive sites. And we're seeing when we cut, a lot of these oaks are not coming back. It's a big concern for a lot of industry that are reliant upon that oak being there in the future. So we're going to go over some of these harvest types and then also options, either replanting or allowing the stand to regenerate naturally. So again, some harvest considerations, other harvest considerations from the landowner aspect. Aesthetics is usually the number one thing I hear about when you give harvest recommendations. I don't want it to look terrible. I saw another property that looked terrible, got destroyed by a harvest. What we really want to emphasize, forest land managers need to emphasize, private landowners need to know, is to think about that 5 to 10 years later. A lot of that brush gets rotted away, especially if you move in from an area out west where things don't rot after 20, 30 years. Things rot pretty quickly here. Stumps rot. You're not doing stumping that some people associate with type of clear cut. And then what species you want to favor, and then what's practical for you. So talked a lot about this in the first talk, but your size of your stand, can it be accessed? And then the quality of your trees. So are you trying to get back that same quality, or are you trying to put better trees in the future? So some wetland considerations, kind of beyond the best management practices, which rutting is included. A lot of our water quality stuff is focused on soil erosion, so preventing nutrients from entering in the stream. What I want to consider also is rutting. So rutting can hurt the future use of a property, meaning that once you rut a stand, it's really hard to remediate that. You can do some ripping, there's some study that showed ripping helps, which it may help, but it does not remediate the stand and is very expensive. So the best thing we can do is prevention. So these wet areas, we need to take additional steps, either put logs on the ground and they run over the logs, or just don't have written in your contract, rutting is not allowed, or they can't harvest during wet times. It needs to be a performance thing. So make sure that rutting is not happening. Even if it's planting pine, plan on planting pine back. Rutting can impact those big divots in the ground. I've seen stands where someone is not willing to go and thin that stand because of the rutting issues. You don't really want to run equipment upon a really rutted stand. So we're talking about even age management systems today. And that's not necessarily clear cut. It just means that the age difference is less than 20% of the stand. So as long as you plan on removing that overstory, it's considered even age. And it favors a lot of those species that we wanted. Those intolerant or intermediate tolerant, basically the pines, poplar, and oaks. So the first one to talk about is clear cut. So where it's like the name implies, it removes all the timber in one cutting. So it's the most economical in most situations, and it may or may not be the best for your objectives. One thing you want to consider when you put a contract together, or your forester is putting the contract together, is to remove all trees. Oftentimes people, depending on the part of the state, whether they have a chipping market for some of the small stuff, they don't want to either cut or remove some of the hardwoods, some of the poor quality hardwoods like sweet gum. You want to make sure at least that's felled on the ground. So if they don't remove it, that at least gets felled, and then you can deal with it later. Having standing trees brings in a lot of costs for then going in and clearing those trees. Remember, those trees are putting out a lot of seed for your next stand. So even if you spray and plant and you leave some of these trees, you're going to get a lot of competition that you don't want. So some pros: produces the most income in most situations. I can't think of a situation where it wouldn't bring in, the most income unless you had a lot of junk that you were paying to remove, right? maybe in that situation, someone would be incented to do a partial harvest. Yeah, they have to be really careful about when someone tries to sell you on something that doesn't make sense. Ask a lot of questions, especially if it's kind of a poor quality stand. You want it cleared. It's worth that extra money to make sure it's cleared. It allows for tree planting and natural regeneration in some cases. So if you don't have good trees there, you can't regenerate good trees. I think if you don't have poplar seed, you're probably not going to get, you may get some. I don't know that I would rely on it. You can, if you're doing natural regen, you want someone to come in a year later or 2 years later, once those seedlings have started to come up, and do it's called a natural regeneration study, where they just walk a line, walk a strips along the property, and they can evaluate, do you have seedlings of intolerant trees, so poplar, white pine, loblolly pine, that sort of thing that you want. If you don't, then you can spray the tract and plant it. If you wait too long to do that, the cost of clearing the tract exponentially goes up. So you want that done within a year, or within really 2 years. So, and then the biggest pro for me is, regardless of the site, you can plant better trees most of the time. If you have kind of a junk oak stand, let's say mainly species that you don't want. Hardwoods are very variable for their genetic quality, so you can, poor quality oak can still put off good quality seedlings. So there's some loose correlation between those. We really haven't, hardwoods are extremely variable on what seedlings get put out. There's the reason why genetic improvements haven't been very quickly for hardwoods. There is some correlation, if you have poor quality species though, then that's not really what you want in the future. Clearing allows it to be planted with either pine, some cases hardwood trees, but mainly when planting, we're talking about pine. So some cons, poor aesthetic quality is a big one. If you leave poor quality trees, and it doesn't work great for oak management. Oak management, we'll talk in depth here in a few minutes. So moving on to a more aesthetically pleasing harvest, not necessarily always the best, but they work for certain situations. A seed tree harvest. So like it sounds, it's leaving certain seed trees out there, usually 10 or 20 per acre, and that produce seed for your next stand. Do you always want a seed tree harvest? No, I would almost personally, as a forester, I would rather a clear cut harvest, because you get to ensure that the trees you put back are really high quality. The seed tree harvest sometimes gets planted underneath. I would say it works well for, let's say, shortleaf pine, or sometimes longleaf pine. And it can work well for silvopasture. So if you want some shade and you don't plan on doing a harvest anytime soon, and put cows in there and do additional work to get stuff underneath, great. For wildlife habitat, nah, you can do a less intensive harvest and still get some of the same benefits back. But people oftentimes like the way it looks, and we'll do a seed tree harvest. So again, pine, mainly pine only. Problem with hardwoods is the epicormic sprouting is a term I'm going to talk about. So that means that branches that aren't there form. So there are a few tree species that do this really well, and they're ones we like. So white oak and yellow poplar. So red oaks do it too. Older trees are less likely to epicormic sprout. So at least that's a good thing. What it is buds are dormant. There's dormant buds underneath the bark of trees. And those buds, once you get some sunlight to the tree, those branches will come up, and they're usually very poor. And if you get them, most of the value of these hardwoods are in the first 8 to 16 feet. So that first log, half log or log, is where most of your value is. If you get sun to that lower bowl, what you do? You just ruin the value of any new growth that appears. Now, those branches don't necessarily penetrate, so if you already have a big tree, maybe it's not as big a deal. But just something to be wary of. It has high aesthetic quality, and oftentimes, it's not regen, it's not free. I like to say it requires additional work, so that may be thinning it early with brush saws. So now we're getting into more complex. There's kind of a continuum of complexity. So there's easy, clear cut, a little bit harder, seed treat, and then shelterwood harvest. Now we could go into the whole hour on shelterwood harvesting. I'm just going to introduce it as a concept and show where it works, so that you can ask about it, ask your forester about it, or ask me and we maybe can do a full thing on it. So it's a multi-step process. It's not just, hey, let's cut and let's get back what we want. So is it right for you? Well, do you have understory trees already there, or do you need to encourage them? So oaks need some shade to get established, and underplanting is a possibility if you don't have them. So first tip, and this is ignored surprisingly a lot. A lot of times people will say, oh yeah, I'll do a shelterwood, or sometimes they call it a select cut, or they select certain trees that should be removed without having trees there that are going to take advantage of that light. Like I talked about earlier, the oak needs to be there before you can get oak in the overstory. This is where you kill pretty much all of the understory trees. If you have a market, it can be commercial, where maybe you remove a few trees and have more valuable cut somewhere close by that they can come in and do this and take out those understory trees. Sometimes it's chipping. It's some way of removing those understory trees, or at least killing them. In the mountains right now, because of the Canton mill shutting down on that second picture I showed you, that was a huge market for pulpwood. It was a paper mill. That market's gone. So if you're in an area without much hardwood markets, NRCS is paying cost share that helps for these tree improvement. And this is an improvement practice. So oftentimes we see poor quality trees in these understory of mature stands. They haven't been disturbed in a long time. And so things like maple and beech that have very low commercial value from the forestry side, and maple low even wildlife value, other than maybe deer eating the leaves. So what can you do? Well, you can do hack and squirt, which is you put an herbicide in where you put a hack with the axe, and then you put some herbicide in there, a concentrate, usually half. Triclopyr is a common one. There's some links to resources for how to do this and some recommended herbicides. Basil bark spraying works too, usually for smaller stem stuff. So it's the basil, which is just outside of the tree. For thin bark trees, you spray with some basil bark oil. You mix that in with the right herbicide, and then it actually works really well at penetrating trees. Big trees don't work as well, so it can be faster. So you have to pick the right method. NRCS right now is recommending removing up to 12-inch trees. That seems big. So 12 inches is for pines, what we call saw timber. So it seems very surprising. 12-inch trees, either 10 or 12-inch trees, they're big, but a lot of times, again, these hardwoods are low value. If you had 12-inch trees of oak or poplar, don't kill it. What we're talking about is pulpwood. No matter how big a red maple tree gets, it's still pulpwood. So just something to keep in mind. So stage 2, this is kind of a picture of a mixed shortleaf pine and oak stand. Shortleaf pine is a great species. It grows well with hardwood, so they wanted to encourage it and just leave scattered, evenly spaced trees. If you're talking about basal area, if you're a forester and knows what that means, 60 basal area is probably 50 or 60 is about as low as you want to get. It's just a measure of the density of the stand. You'll get those numbers when you have a management plan done, they'll tell you the density of the stand, and it's called feet squared per acre. So estimated within a plot. So usually natural stands are around 150, let's say, or 200, even 220. It just depends on the productivity. So more productivity, more density. Lower productivity usually has lower density, can handle less trees. So usually think removing half the trees is pretty good. It's commercial, so you're making money on it, and that disturbance will cause trees to resprout. So I think you're kind of simulating major disturbance in the forest and trying to encourage some of those trees that are like that back. The last one is a lot of times people kind of ignore this, which, to be fair, your stand looks beautiful. You've done all this work. Now you're talking about removing the overstory and doing almost what seems like a clear-cut harvest. I do recommend you do leave a few of your trees for wildlife and leave some of that generational DNA from those trees in the stand. There's some benefit having those big trees still there. And they keep producing acorns. So it takes oak trees about 20 years to produce acorns. Well, you don't want to, clear all your trees that are producing acorns if wildlife is during the winter time, those acorns really matter for a lot of species, deer, squirrel, others. And then don't forget the follow-up work. So this is where you're talking about having a budget and a long-term plan. Well, you want to do that follow-up work 10 to 15 years later. That's usually tending. So you get your oak trees back. Well, they're competing with all these trees. Usually you pick about 60 to 70 your best oak trees. So white oak, northern red oak, scarlet oak even, and then clear just around those trees to encourage those trees to keep growing. Release 3 to 4 sides. If you look at a tree in a quadrant, so you see those trees with canopies either growing on top or next to, you want to clear those trees right around your desirable trees. So last one, and I won't get into this one too much other than just to let you know it's a thing, is expanding gap, is where it's very similar to, it's similar and different to shelterwood harvesting. So all it means is the first harvest kind of looks just like you would do with a shelterwood harvest, where you're clearing the understory. The difference is you include some openings. So people talk about group selection. I'm not going to talk about group selection today. It's just where this is a better version of it, of you just picking groups in the forest that you clear, and then allowing the shade from the edge trees to shade and encourage positive oak trees back. So you can either do strips, you can cut it in strips and then encourage seedlings back in, or you could just do clumps at about a half acre to 1 acre in size, and then you clear the understory trees between it. So this is kind of what it looks like. This shows a bunch of stages, usually 3, just like shelterwood harvest is practical. This is obviously, or it started in Europe. You can see it's German. So the German word that sometimes gets imported is Femmelschlag. The red is the remaining trees. But from a principal standpoint, it looks like this, where you do some openings and then you find where those best trees are, and then you just open again those openings. Is it practical? Well, we're doing a bunch of research on, let's see if I have another one. Yeah, so expanding the gap. Pick these best spots, oak regen. There's a lot of research being done in Pisgah Forest and on State Forest Service land. So if you go to DuPont, if you're up in the mountains, when it reopens, they will have examples of this. So I'm sure someone from the State Forest Service would love to show you around, to show their research into expanding gap. So if you're a forester or if you're a landowner that's like, that seems interesting, that's cool, then go look at it. That's the best way. I like to see what some of these practices are. There's these experimental forests where they're doing all these practices, and you can go out and look at what they are. So from the tree planting side, last practice before we really get into all the tree species is afforestation. So that means that trees weren't there as a field before. We call it afforestation or instead of reforestation, which is you're replanting a stand, you're making a new stand. So you're planting an old field. Pine is usually the best option, and hardwoods are a possibility just because you don't have very much competition in there. Some considerations for old fields are the soil compaction. So you can actually have this tested with a meter, how hard it is to push down. Mineral soils usually aren't as, once you get towards the coastal plain, you start to see more organic sites. Soil compaction becomes a much bigger deal. You have increased deer and rodent damage, so which is why pines do a little bit better because they're treated for making the needles resistant towards deer. Deer don't like it. Deer really love young hardwoods. So just, concern, maybe plant more seedlings than you think you'll need. Or they make these tree shelters that you can put on your trees if you really want that there. If you're going to do an orchard type deal, maybe do some type of deer fencing. And then the size of your field for future management. So if you have a 5-acre field, you can plant it in pine, but you have to have some other type of forest you're managing with it. You can't just manage something in isolation that's pine alone. So if you have 30 acres, then yes. If you have 5 acres or something less than 30 acres, probably not. A lot of fields get planted with no plan for management in the future. So definitely think about that as you're planning. What does that harvest look like? So some trees to plant. So kind of put planting options. Loblolly pine. Had to start there. We talked about all these pine planting incentives. It's still king in the Piedmont and coastal plain below 2,000 feet elevation. Once you get above 2,000 feet, it kind of tapers off. Probably don't plant it there. It can be hurt by frost damage. So just some things to think about. It's relatively cheap. Benefits is we've had genetically improved pine. It's one of those trees that it doesn't matter the site. It does matter the site and how well it'll grow, but it's surprisingly consistent in its form. So if you plant a really high quality genetically improved seedling in a high productivity site and you plant that same seedling in a low productivity site, the difference is it'll grow differently, or it'll grow different speeds, but it'll still look good. It'll still show its form in almost the same way. I won't say exactly the same way. I'm not 100% sure on exactly the same way, but pretty close. It'll have it'll drop off its lower branches if you plant them in the same way. So newly planted pines grow about, improved pines grow about 40 to 100% faster than unimproved pines. So, and the cons is some areas have a lack of pulpwood market. So if you've had a mill closed nearby, doesn't mean new mills won't come in. Pine trees grow in about 25 years, so that's enough time for new markets to develop. But you can adjust your spacing requirements. So it's just something to think about what future management options are available. So for planting, either 8x10 or 9x10 foot spacing, if early thinning is the option. If you have pulpwood, which is our lowest value tree, so that's usually under 10 inches. If thinning is an option at 12 years old, then plant thick pine, and then it's been done for the past, however many years since the 80s. So plant thick and then thin. If you have no pulpwood market, there's been a bunch of research into, optimal, planting. 10x12 has been shown as a really good spacing if you don't have a pulpwood market, meaning that, okay, let's plant this stand with the plan of just growing it for 30 years and then cutting it. You can expect about 90% survival on most pine stands. That's dramatically improved over the years. Used to be, we said 80% or 70% even. 90% is what it is in the past about decade. So without a huge storm, just on average. So if you have 90%, you have about 300 trees grow to maturity, and that's about what you want, even after thinning. So if you plant 500 trees, you thin about 200 trees, and then you let about 300 trees grow to maturity. So that's kind of where that math, works out. It's just a rule of thumb. Maybe you get 100% survival, and then 10 by 12 would still be fine. So some seedling options, starting with loblolly pine because it has the most options. You have bare root seedlings. They are just pulled up and then planted. Still the most common way to plant pine. It's cheap. They're sold by the thousand. And then the cons is you kind of have a limited planting window. So in North Carolina, in the Piedmont and Coastal Plain, we're usually looking at before March 15th was kind of a cutoff. So January to March 15th. In the world of, climate change and, some of those growing seasons starting earlier and earlier, or unpredictability for when that last frost-free day, we'll say, is, there have been a lot of late plantings that it's really hard to tell when pine trees break dormancy, even in the nursery. So there's been some things where they put all this effort, even if they certify the seedlings and they'll reimburse you for the seedlings, you put all this site prep work and all this work into planting it, and you planted bare root seedlings late, then, or let's say during COVID time, there weren't many crews available, so it took them a lot longer to get stuff planted. Well, they're getting to yours at March 30th, and the trees broke dormancy and you didn't know it. You planted them and they failed. So now you go back a year later, maybe have to do site prep work again. Maybe it's okay, but just it's a risk. So a lot of consultants, a lot of landowners are moving to containerized seedlings. You have a much wider planting window, higher survival rates. They're easier to plant, and it works for almost all the pines. So regardless of whether you're planting shortleaf, longleaf, especially if you're planting shortleaf and longleaf, you want to containerize seedlings. I would only do loblolly and hardwoods and bare root. They have all the roots there. They usually, right after you plant it, growing season, they shoot up a little bit faster. And then colin, it's more expensive. So you gotta decide that risk versus reward. I'm not going to tell you the right answer. Probably depends on the site, but it's just an option out there. So there's genetic improvements. And when you're looking at the seed, you can ask for a sheet that's called a performance rating sheet. I won't get into it, but just know that's out there. It explains itself in the sheet. There's a percent of how well it does compared to other seedlings. There's a rust resistance. So certain pines get pine blister rust. And it's kind of opposite to the productivity. So the more resistant it is, usually they don't grow as fast. And if you're in an area that doesn't have blister rust, then plant a more productive tree, and then the stem form grade. So how well that tree looks at maturity. So some tree planting challenges, again, drought, there's ice damage, deer damage, insect damage. I'm gonna kind of move through this quickly because got a bunch of other slides, but so poor sites, you need to plant them deep. There's research that shows the deeper you plant trees, the better survival rate. Sometimes people kind of give, unless you're in longleaf. Longleaf requires you plant it right at the ground level. Loblolly, you want to plant as deep as you can. Machine planting has been shown to have consistently higher survival rates, mainly because it plants very deep. Some other factors we already talked about, the seedling care, and then again, poor planting practices. So some mountain options, white pine. So you can, it's great on certain sites. It's best in a monoculture plantation, so it means you have to spray, very sensitive to competition. But high quality white pine trees can sell for really high value. You can clear the branches. So if you spray and plant a bunch of these trees, you can, for age 3 to 5, there's a narrow window where you can trim the trees every year for a couple times a year for holiday wreaths. So we have a Christmas tree extension office. You can talk to them about, some of these options for trees, Christmas trees. 10 by 10 spacing is common, similar to pine or loblolly. Just get up with them. So for shortleaf pine, it grows really well in these really poor quality soils. It's native. It grows a little bit slower than loblolly. Similar spacing to loblolly too. For oak planting, generally not done other than open fields. So for upland oaks, it actually can be underplanted on some of these stands. But the larger the seedling, the better. So if you want to throw away your small seedlings, if you have a batch, the North Carolina Forest Service Nursery usually sells really good quality seedlings, from what I hear. They require competition control. So if you don't spray and clear around these trees, then they'll pass away, they'll die. So for the bottomland oaks in the coastal plain, focus on bottomland trees. Don't try and plant upland trees in the bottomland. Is really the bottomland oaks can handle some periodic flooding, but you can't have any standing water there. So some others, poplar, yellow poplar, grows on a wide range of sites, but generally has poor survival. Planted in fields, planted in the mountains all the time, not always a great option, but if you want poplar, try and rely on natural regen if you can. There's some others, hardwoods, just get asked about, hybrid poplar, sycamore, not many markets, but they plant really well, they grow really fast, and maybe in the future, if we have some energy markets, it might do great. Black walnut, you get asked about it a lot, maybe for nut production, but that's about it. We don't really have the high quality walnut you see in some parts of the world or parts of the US. So I just kind of avoid it for timber production. But the walnuts are really valuable. They can be sold for a lot of different products. The aviation industry uses them, people eat them, but make sure, before you rely on it, that you have those markets there. So some natural regen options. You're going to be doing some type of harvest like we talked about, the shelterwood harvest or expanding gap harvest. So, but you want to know there's contractors available to actually do some of this work. You need a skilled forester to mark the trees. You need someone in there to release the trees. And make sure you have the right trees you want before you do a lot of this work, or plan on doing some underplanting. So for oak, the taller seedlings you have, the better. These are natural, so we call it advanced regeneration, meaning they're already there. The taller, if they're above 5 feet, let's say, then that's a good rule of thumb for, hey, this is going to survive and do well once you release it. You want to have more than 200 per acre before you do that first commercial harvest. That's what the prep harvest is kind of encouraging some of these oaks to come in while clearing killing some of the poor quality hardwoods to encourage those mature ones to seed in and them to grow up. You can see a lot of tiny seedlings. That tiny seedling does not mean that tree is going to grow up. It needs to have just enough sun for those trees to get tall. Then it had the reserves, the root reserves to grow. So some considerations. Again, well, actually, I didn't mention this. So medium to poor quality sites, it's going to be very competitive. Some of these high quality sites is going to be difficult to manage oak. If you want oak to stay in some of these sites, just leave some of the oaks. It may not come back, but at least you'll have it there in the future. Maybe a few oaks come back, maybe you release around just get lucky. So leave a few of your oaks if you do a type of harvest in some of these high quality stands. So poplar, clear cutting is actually the preferred method. Selectively harvesting can work. We've seen these stands get, mined or destructively harvested. Didn't really matter what happened to it, and it came back in pure poplar. It's a kind of remarkable tree. It grows well in monoculture stands, so it grows in mixed stands too. Monoculture stands is generally, it doesn't matter how thick it is. You don't have to worry about thinning it. And it prefers high quality sites. So for pine, loblolly pine works well too for natural regen. Again, the planted pine does a little bit better. Shortleaf pine and longleaf pine are very site specific. You want either poor quality sites, or do some type of burning, thinning to encourage it. So for some thoughts on natural regen of pine, it's not free. It does require thinning. And then you think about your goals, whether they're restoration or timber production. Just to mention it, we do have some swamp species in North Carolina. So the coast, you want the right site and the right hydrology really matters. That you need some standing water, but not too much. You need to have some seed movement come in if you do harvest. So if you remove all of your, let's say, bald cypress and you don't have any seed, well, it's not going to come back in bald cypress. You need to make sure that it was either heavy masting year, heavy fruiting year before that. Have some way to make sure that you get seedlings back. You don't necessarily want to always plant these stands. You can plant them if you don't have any. Usually requires some bedding to, at least when the seedling establishes, it needs some clear bare soil. After that, they can be flooded. Some people say it needs to be flooded for nutrients. So just things to keep in mind if you're doing a swamp species. You really want, some people say they shouldn't ever be harvested, which isn't exactly fair. Just if you cut, you need to make sure that hydrology is the whole area is pretty steady. If you get any salt intrusion from sea level rise or beaver dam nearby, then you can be kind of messed up and it just won't come back. So it's you need someone experienced and be willing to work with you on the right timing, right site, the right year. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of luck that goes into cutting it and making sure it comes back. Here's just a chart to kind of finish up. You can look back into some of our resources, just a simple chart. Though one in the publication looks better than this, I just noticed it's kind of cut off for those regen methods. You have kind of tells a harvest type, the shade tolerance, some regen method options that generally preferred. So for oak, natural regen; for poplar, it's either stump sprouting or seed. And then the rotation length. So how long is it between harvesting? Cypress and Atlantic white cedar can go up to, much longer than 150 years. But generally, if you're growing it for production, you're trying to have a shorter rotation length as possible. So there's some resources provided. So if you want to talk with someone about doing some of these resources, you can look at the resource. You can contact NRCS. They have technical service providers through the website that can tell you if they can provide cost share for doing any type of work. Contact a consultant forester that represents you, and that's kind of where I'll leave it. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer that, or happy to respond later if you have any questions. So let me stop sharing if I can get my thing back.
All right, folks, if you do have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature of Zoom and we'll go to that to ask questions. But there is one in chat, so we'll catch that question first. And it was asked about 1237. So earlier in your presentation there, Jameson,
Yeah.
And Faith is wondering, is this the treatment abbreviation on Forest Service seedlings, deer and rodents?
No, so they're actually treated for deer, and Pale's weevil is pretty common treatment on it. There are some other things they can put on the seedlings to prevent it from drying out. Rodents is not something they necessarily treat for. You can have rodent problems in fields in forests. Usually it's not a big a problem because you have other trees there, have other things growing. Just in the fields, they tend to can attack seedlings. Hardwoods it's a bigger problem than even pine, but just something out there that not always a problem, but could be.
So a question from Terry Beasley. What would be the expected survival rate when planting hardwoods?
That's a good question. I don't think that there is expected. I think that sometimes you get high success, sometimes you get 10% or less. It's I'll put it here is plant a bunch of seedlings, and then maybe you can get some of them to survive. It really depends on the site, the year, competition control, all those things really matter.
I do know, Jameson, from my experience with oak and everything, oftentimes when we had the larger root collar diameter, or oftentimes we actually counted the number of lateral roots. And if we had 5 or more lateral roots, our survival rates were much higher than just taking the run of the mill stuff that we get from a nursery and stuff. So a lot of times we'd call before we even plant it. But you're right, it's very variable. And sites make a big difference. Next question. First of all, somebody asked about today's slides. They are available on the portal where you joined today. And I also already put the link in the chat, so you can click on that and it would download the slides straight to your computer. Next question is from James Barnett. And James is wondering, do you have an opinion on diameter limit harvest?
I can say this about diameter limit harvest. So assuming it means collectively what it kind of means is that you have, let's say you have some threshold for saw timber in the mountains, they like over 16 inches, trees over 16-inch diameter. So they say, hey, we're gonna clear all of the trees above a 16-inch threshold and leave the rest to grow. Usually that's kind of a way to market and make it sound good. Does it get done all the time? And then sometimes favorable trees grow back? Yes. Is it, I don't love being constrained by, usually that means it's for the ease of access of the person actually doing the harvest. So what it means is someone is not being very intentional about the stand. I wouldn't ever do something where someone says, hey, I'm a diameter limited harvest. It means they're not necessarily marking the stand. They're just cutting the big trees and then leaving the poor quality trees, because usually the best trees grew to that size. So the trees under that size are not growing. Sometimes they're the same age. So hardwood trees, the ones that take up the most resources will grow big. So generally that degrades the stand over time, especially as something gets diameter limited once, twice, 3 times. That's kind of, I don't love it. People do it. Just generally, if you hear that wording, I wouldn't hire that person. That's just me.
Yeah, often referred to as high grading.
Or high grading, yeah.
Next, Carl DuPont would like to know, biodiversity is key. Any thoughts?
So generally, I would say you want to, so you can plant and encourage biodiversity. It depends what stand you're in. So if you're in a longleaf stand, you probably should not be spraying and like clearing all of your biodiversity in your understory. You're talking about more mechanical work where you're doing cutting and then also just encouraging the trees you want. You can have a lot of biodiversity and encourage oaks. Shortleaf grows well with other trees, so you're generally looking for more of these mixed stands. If you do no management, I'll put it this way, usually generally it goes towards less diverse stands as red maple, rhododendron come into a stand. So regular disturbance that tries to kind of mimic what Native Americans or what people have practiced for hundreds or thousands of years generally encourages biodiversity. I will say some stands are just naturally not diverse in the overstory. Poplar stands are generally monoculture. Try to reintroduce some other species. Try to have a mixed stand. So.
Okay, we have a question also from James Barnett. Are you seeing pine thinning programs tending towards leaving higher basal area because of crazy weather we have seen and been experiencing?
I don't know that that has impacted people's so the question is, so I don't know that, weather events, individual weather events have changed people's recommendations. Usually in areas, there's an ice belt in North Carolina, so the top part of our state generally gets ice. Usually they leave higher basal areas in areas that get hot ice. The problem is you, with our lower pulpwood markets, people are wanting to thin more than so there's some, the market drives management much more than, weather events. I'll put it that way.
Okay. Yeah, he did come back just now and said specifically winds in the lower southern states. I would say, maybe the way to phrase this question would be around with, as we get more intense storms because of our warmer climate, are we seeing any change in management around that?
I'd say if you want to really make it a more resilient stand, look at planting more resilient species. Intensive harvests are still getting done in the same way they've gotten done. So there is a lot of concern with this. I would say more people are looking into long-term management options or doing things like burning that creates more of a resilient stand. Longleaf is a great option for if you're in a hurricane-prone area. It's kind of hard to manage around. Let's say this hurricane in the mountains is once in whatever 1,000-year storm. It's kind of hard to manage around dramatic things like that. Other than maybe, hey, let's look at more resilient species. So burning is definitely a practice that is getting a lot of consideration for, let's say, preventing catastrophic fire and making resilient stands. So.
Okay, and our last question. Oh, looks like we got two questions. Nope, just one more question, and it's from Faith. At what height are hardwoods safe from deer pressure?
Ooh, well, definitely above where they can reach. 15 feet is pretty high enough to where they're pretty safe. Just they're very susceptible when they're very short. So let's say they're a foot or two tall. If you have really fast growing trees and you have a lot of trees, then, we don't get the deer pressure that, let's say, Pennsylvania or some other states get. If you're in a really high deer pressure area, I would consider doing some type of shelter, getting it to maybe 10 feet tall. So that, yeah, that's a good question. I can find some resource for that. I don't know that exact height, but definitely taller than they can reach. So.
I know in the Midwest where I started out my career and stuff, like oak seedlings, our goal was to get them to 4.5, 5 feet tall and about as thick as your thumb at the ground. And those seem to do well. I do know I remember seeing in the upper lake states and stuff where there were studies being done where they actually put up deer fencing, and if you stood in an area that wasn't fenced, it was like being in a park with everything just cleared up to about 5, 6, 8 feet by the
Yeah.
pressure of the deer and stuff. It was quite amazing. All right, with that, folks, we do appreciate you joining today's webinar and everything. Jameson, thank you for putting together a great talk and presentation. Folks, the resources Jameson mentioned are back at forestrywebinars.net on today's webinar. You can get to it at the same link you joined today. And thank you all for joining. And with that, we'll bring this to an end.